living on the lands of the Bumurang people. And a story I think that's worth telling at the start is that this week is Reconciliation Week. About 3 years ago, the Uluru Statement from the Heart was released by Australia's Indigenous people. And it was this idea where they wanted to be represented and recognised in the Constitution, that Australia recognises the history of the Indigenous people of this country in our Constitution, but also that they wanted a voice, and that voice would help determine the policies and the decisions that affect First Nations people in this country. But the really interesting thing about this voice is that this is not a new concept. It's a concept that's been around for decades and decades. Sadly, at the time, Malcolm Turnbull dismissed the voice, and it was pretty devastating, I know, for a lot of the people who put together the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And Morrison hasn't really been much better. He's sort of left the door open slightly for a referendum, but he certainly hasn't been as encouraging as we would like. And you know, I don't say this with any great joy, but it can't be left up to the Labor Party to do this by ourselves. We need the coalition, and we need both sides of politics to push through a referendum. And it is something that should happen in this country. And to give you a sense of how it relates back to us even more, someone who I know all of you would have heard about is obviously William Cooper, who was the man who led the Australian Aborigines League on a march from Footscray into the German High Consul in 1938, protesting the Kristallnacht. And William Cooper wrote a letter to the King at that a few years later, calling for a voice for Australian Aboriginal people to have more of a say, and he wanted also Indigenous representation in the Parliament. Thankfully, we do have Indigenous representation in the Parliament. We had Pat Dodson, who did the Marek Edelman lecture with Skiff, which was a really brilliant night. I know many people were here on this Zoom were there that night, but Pat's there, Malandiri McCarthy, Linda Burney, and of course the first ever Minister for Indigenous Affairs, who is an Aboriginal person, is Ken Wyatt, currently in the federal parliament. Plus, we've had other representation previously and across the country in state parliaments as well. So there has been progress, but I think that this is again one of those things that's worth mentioning anytime we gather, and it's worth mentioning especially this week in National Reconciliation Week, and hopefully we'll all get to vote on a referendum to recognise our First Nations people in our Constitution. Now, on that note, Chaverim, I've been asked tonight to talk about how Skiff and Skiff's ideologies helped shape my ideas and who I am tonight, which is a really cool thing to sort of stop and think about for a little bit. But of course, it wasn't just Skiff's ideologies that influenced me. I remember Skiff taught me a whole range of other things as well. And the first story I'll tell you is one of the ones from summer camp. So before you all went to Charnwood, every single year, we went to a campsite called Lady Northcote. And Lady Northcote was this huge, beautiful campsite. Anyway, one of the best things about Lady Northcote campsite is that during mealtimes, they had this cordial dispenser. And, you know, if you've ever been on Skiff camp, cordial dispensers are a real luxury. Anyway, it not only dispensed the cordial, it chilled the cordial. So you got chilled, delicious cordial on meals. It was living, right? It was one of the best things on camp. Anyway, we were obnoxious Skiffist, and we had, I won't mention his name, but we had one particular member of our cries who just always managed to become the butt of our jokes. Anyway, he was on digital. So he was the person who, we weren't allowed to get up during the mealtime. He had to go and get the cordial, which I think is still traditional in camp. Yeah, I'm getting a few nods from some of the helper, which is good. So he had to go and get the cordial. And anyway, we made it our mission that every single time he would walk to the cordial dispenser and get back to the table, the bottle was drunk and he had to go straight back and keep getting this cordial dispenser. It was cruel. But the condition was, with our helper, was that we weren't allowed to go to the bathroom the entire meal. We had to just drink and deal with the consequences. So that there's no real point to that story. It just is one of those things I'll never forget about Skiff Camp. It was one of the most brilliant things, and I'll always remember the Skiff cordial dispenser that we made our poor skiffist not sit down the entire meal. It was one of my favorite memories of camp. I loved it. Anyway, I think what I'll do tonight and what I'll try and talk about. The only other thing also to mention was that the Stone Age Olympiad was the best ever Olympiad team there's ever been assembled, and the Capitan was one of the best. Anyway, we can do some research. Also, not only was the Capitan one of the strongest Capitans, the song is still sung, I believe, on camp. It's one of the greatest songs ever written on a skiff camp, controversially, that some may say. I don't think it was ever sung after that camp. Anyway, so let's go through some of the big three and how I think it shapes me today, and then I'd really like to open up to questions and not just talk tonight, because it should be a discussion and it should be interactive. So the first one is Chavashaft. So Chavashaft obviously manifested itself in many different ways in Skiff Camp, and for me, the thing that is most vivid, the most vivid recollection of what Chavashaft meant on Skiff and what Chavashaft meant to me was at mealtime again, where no one would get seconds if there weren't enough seconds for everyone, and that we would all do the Stille Minute and would eat at the same time. And this idea that we are all equal and that we are all, that there is no one special on camp. There's no one that's more deserving of food than someone else. There's no one more equal than anyone else. And I think if we stop and think about the world that has unfolded in the last 2 to 3 months, if we have ever had another reminder of the equality of humanity than this coronavirus, I can't think of it. This virus does not discriminate. No one and no human is more equal. Unfortunately, some people become more sick and some people don't, but each and every person is susceptible to this virus. Each and every person can pass it on, and each and every person has to be able to deal with it together. And I think that for me, the way in which we deal with this virus needs to be at the forefront of our thinking in terms of how we treat each other, how we make sure that we don't leave people behind. The biggest examples that are in my mind at the moment is housing. I don't think we've ever had a time in history where housing has been as important to society, where housing and homelessness is not just something that we can sort of look at and wish we needed to fix, but something that we actually needed to do something. To give you an indication of what we've been doing in housing and some of the extraordinary things that have happened, the city of Melbourne wanted to reduce homelessness in the CBD. I think they had a 10-year plan to reduce homelessness in the city of Melbourne. Well, due to the coronavirus, they did it in 2 days. They managed to get people into hotels. It was expensive. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it happened. And I think that if we remember that we're all in this together, that we are equal in trying to tackle this virus and we are equal in trying to deal with it, then it will lead us in good stead, and it will focus us, and it will help us concentrate on the ways in which we need to get through this together. I think the other big thing that Chavashaft tells me, and Chavashaft crystallizes in my mind, is that we've had probably the biggest jump in unemployment and hardship in all of our lives. Probably some people here have lived through depressions, but this has been the biggest change to our world that I think we've all lived through. We had previously in Australia about 600,000 people on some form of welfare. That number's now doubled, and it's closer to 1.3 million people. And when you combine that with the fact that we've now got 3.5 million people, not 6.5 million people on the JobKeeper, that tells us that we basically have almost 4 million people, or around 4 million, just over 4 million people in Australia, essentially on unemployment benefits, and essentially being supported by the government, which is an extraordinary amount. But if that doesn't tell you that throughout no fault of their own, and throughout sometimes by um, by absolutely no fault of one's own, and through things that we can't control, people find themselves without work and without the ability to support themselves, then I don't know what does. And we can't be leaving people behind. We can't be leaving people without the ability to fend for themselves. Today, I went and saw Attica, which Attica Soup Project, which is it's a collaboration between a well-meaning person, refugee advocate, and someone who and the Attica restaurant, which is a pretty ritzy, schmancy restaurant, and they're basically making soup for international people and temporary visa holders who are stuck here, many of whom can't get home and who aren't receiving support by the government. The federal government also isn't supporting casual workers. They're not supporting people in the arts and entertainment industry. And probably worst of all, they're not supporting temporary visa holders, including temporary protection visa holders, which essentially are refugees in Australia who have been granted refugee status, but the government just isn't supporting because they're a temporary visa holder. And the cynic in me tells me that they're just not supporting them because they can't vote. We had a plan to abolish temporary protection visas at the last election, but anyway, it's that I remember in 2001 when I went to the Tampa rally with Skiff, and this idea of just because someone wasn't born here doesn't mean that we don't look after them, and just because someone wasn't born in this country doesn't mean we don't have a sense of fairness as well. And I think that this is one of the tragic things that are coming out of this coronavirus, is that perhaps we are leaving people behind in this country, and there is a need. I think overall there has been some really, really good things that the government's done, and you got to praise them for that. But doing some good things is not the aspiration. Doing all of the good things is the aspiration. And I think that's central to Skiff's values, and that's certainly something that we should be aiming for as a country. The other things I wanted to talk about with Doikite. So for me, Doikite was this idea that you should be proud to be Jewish wherever you are, and if that's in New York or Caulfield or Jerusalem or Buenos Aires or Paris or anywhere, you are who you are, and you should stand up for who you are. And one of the things that I'm really worried that's unfolding, and one of the things that I think is happening more broadly, is the rise of nationalism coming out of the coronavirus. I think that as countries are becoming more secluded, there are different manifestations of that. We're seeing that in Australia, we're going to have to make things, and we're going to have to recover our economy without as much international travel for a while. That's just a reality. But that doesn't mean that we should be pointing the finger unnecessarily at other people, and that doesn't mean that we don't need to be careful about our language around the coronavirus. The biggest example of that, I think, that I don't think the government's doing particularly well right now, is obviously, if we want to, and I can see that we've got Dr. Ringelblum on the line here. This is a health pandemic, and at some point it would be really important for us to know how this thing began, and it would be really important for us to know what could have been done to prevent and save more lives, not just in Australia but right across the world. That is an important and worthwhile exercise that we shouldn't be afraid to assert. But if you look at some of the language that's been used in this topic, I would say it's been unnecessarily inflammatory, and I'd also say that it's been quietly and subtly, and in some cases not so subtly, giving the green light to finger pointing and racism within Australia. And especially, it's hardly surprising that we're seeing a spike in anti Asian Australian incidents and anti-Asian Australian racism, which is something that none of us should be comfortable with. But I also think that what we're seeing is, and this is perhaps not really the fault of the government, but like it or not like it, we're seeing a rise in a range of conspiracy theories and sort of mistruths in a world of sort of post-truth, Trumpian post-truth, that people are coming up with all sorts of absurd theories and not listening to the facts and not listening to the science. 5G did not cause the coronavirus. That's an announcement for everyone tonight. It wasn't 5G. 5G, it helps connect your telephone pretty quickly. That's about what it does. But it certainly didn't connect the coronavirus. But the reason why, you sort of say it and it's sort of a bit funny, but unfortunately, there are pretty sinister and dark conspiracy theories attached to some of these ideas. And I think that perhaps we need to do a better job of making sure that that the sort of finger pointing, the racism, and the dog whistling that comes out of this doesn't allow itself to exacerbate in Australia. And finally, Yiddishkeit. So we express ourselves as Jews in a number of different ways, and we express ourselves through Yiddish culture and language, and we express ourselves proudly and loudly. But we also, throughout history, have turned to Jewish culture and expression to help get us through these and to reflect on these enormous historical moments. I have such great memories of April 19th rehearsals and of summer camps, of learning songs and learning about the songs of the ghetto and songs of the experience of Holocaust survivors, Yiddish songs, Yiddish music, Yiddish theatre. We have some Yiddish theatre stars with us tonight. But it's about reflecting. It's about reflecting the moment in history, and each one of us right now is living through a moment in history. This is an extraordinary thing that is happening to the world. And what we need is different ways to understand it. What we need is different ways to comprehend it. And we need different ways to express ourselves in this moment. And unfortunately, in Australia, our creative industries and our people who work in the arts have, for a long time, had it pretty difficult. If you ask anyone who works in creative industries, it's not easy. It's pretty tough to make a living. But it's especially tough right now when you can't have any live music, any live theatre, any live performances at all. Huge amounts of revenue for the entertainment industry has completely disappeared, and they're probably the first industry to shut down, and they'll probably be the last one to open up again. It's really tough, and unfortunately, the government, I think, is what made a huge mistake in not supporting Australian artists throughout this time. And I think that it's not only important for jobs, and it's not only important for us as a country to have people connected to their work and connected to their jobs, because it's your sense of who you are and your mental health and your sense of being and belonging. But it's also, I think, a real missed opportunity to reflect the pretty extraordinary times that we have right now. The government has also lowered Australian screen quotas and basically meant that less Australian content can be on TV. And I just think that now's the time that we should be expressing ourselves as a country a bit more and supporting artists and supporting the Australian culture at the moment and Australian stories, just as we have turned to Yiddishkeit and our own expression in the past. So I think that there are three contemporary examples of the way in which Skiff has helped shape who I am. And I think ultimately Skiff gave me a framework and a sense of belonging, a confidence, but also at its very core, a reminder each and every time you think about an issue of put yourself in someone else's shoes, try and empathize with them, and try and stick to how you want to be treated. And it's not that complicated, but it's really important. And it doesn't matter what arena or what room you're in, whether it's wax house, your own home, school, university, your workplace, to carry that sense of justice that Skiff gives you, even sometimes the House of Representatives, to carry that sense of what Skiff gives you is something that doesn't leave you, just like the cordial incidences on summer camp. It's the things that you just doesn't leave you. So on that note, I might leave it there, and let's have a bit more of a discussion for however long I've got left with you all. I think we've got about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. Who's going to ask the first question? You have to take yourself off mute, but someone don't be shy. Yes.
Am I on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. David,
okay.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, good.
Okay, I'll throw a curly one at you.
Why not?
Knowing what you know about Skiff,
yeah.
As a Skiffist who believes in the ideologies of Skiff and the Bund, which party should I vote for?
I'm going to you should put yourself on mute so you can't respond. No, you can stay off mute. You should 100% vote for the Australian Labor Party.
Elaborate. Okay, let me ask you another way.
Do you think
Labor or the Greens is more aligned?
No, the Greens are a pain. But anyway, look, the Labor Party is not perfect, David, and you know that. And you and I have had some wonderful discussions about the flaws and imperfections of a political party. And each and every political party has some good bits and some bad bits. That's the nature of the beast. So of course, I don't pretend to agree with each and every one of my colleagues on each and every single thing. But I will say this, that the union movement and Skiff certainly begat as a workers' rights movement. The Bund in Poland was a union. It was a powerful union, and it fought for Jewish rights in the workplace and Jewish rights as people inside the country. It was a movement of solidarity, and it was a movement of change. If it weren't for some politics, it may have been a movement that in Australia may have been affiliated with the Labor Party. Who knows? But I still think that the Labor Party is a party that, at its core, and when we're at our best, thinks about people who need representation and who need a collective voice. And sometimes that manifests itself in a really good way, and we advocate for people who need a voice. And sometimes, that decision and that conflict, David, is really difficult because, for example, right now we have a lot of the union movement calling for less international trade and more manufacturing inside Australia, which ultimately there's probably got to be a bit of both. But we don't want to be demonising international workers, and it's the Labor Party that has to find a way through a very complex issue that ultimately we don't want to disregard the interests of workers, but at the same time, we are also the party that has opened Australia up to Asia and the region, and we are the party that has had this concept of a big Australia and a welcoming Australia. So it is just one example, and I'm sure there's plenty of specific issues that we could talk about. Sometimes the differentiation and the conflict of interest is difficult, but ultimately there's a sense of value of standing up for people who need a voice. And I think that is the most aligned with Skiff, and that is the Labor Party. The Greens are very good on the environment. The Greens are a pure party that don't have to exercise change, which gives them a lot more freedom. But at the same time, being a protest party is not really about changing the world. And for me, even though Skiff is a small movement, I never saw Skiff as a protest movement. I saw it as an ideology that wanted to help shape a worldview and help influence change. But that is a really good question.
Thank you.
Who's got the next one?
Josh?
Yes. Was macht die Jid?
Jid macht Kinder. Listen, I was going to ask you about the conflict between, you railed just now against nationalism that's taking over the world and chauvinism on the one hand. On the other hand, you said we need to protect the Australian film and entertainment industries. I was going to ask about that, but you've kind of answered that. If you want to elaborate on that, I wouldn't mind. But on this more broad topic, you just said nobody in any party agrees with everybody within it. I'm more interested in policy than people. If you're not going to get in too much trouble, Tell me one policy in the Labor Party where you think it's too far to the left and one policy where you think it's too far to the right.
All right. This stays in Wax House, doesn't it? This answer stays in Wax House. All right, very good.
I do want to say that this is being recorded, though.
Ah, brilliant. All right, well, that's a good warning.
Cut this out, or yeah,
that's a good warning. No, so too far to the left. I think let's go to the right. I think that some of our environmental policies could be strengthened, especially around exploration of gas and the way in which we think about our natural resources and the way in which we siphon off our natural resources. I think we can do better than what we are at the moment, and I think that we have a long way to go, and we have some big internal discussions to go. But I certainly think that we can probably sharpen that up a little bit. From the other side, I don't have much on
nothing
our
is
left
too
flanks.
far to the left.
Our left flank's okay. I mean, I think that I think that a point of conflict, and I think that something that's going to be a real tension in the party is sort of what I was talking about, and goes to your first question, of this idea of building the economy inside Australia versus, you know, a real keen sense of multilateralism. And I think ultimately this is going to be a really difficult question for us to answer, and the government's going to have a far more hammered approach to this, or heavy-handed approach to this, and are going to have a pretty easy narrative to talk about. But post a, I think that you can have an international multilateral approach to the economy, have an idea of a big Australia where we welcome people at the same time supporting industry in Australia. And the biggest example I have of that is at the time when our Australian dollar was high, the government, instead of supporting the biggest industry of research, development, engineers, etc., in the car industry through a support and industry policy, decided to go to and let the car industry go overseas. This I think ultimately comes down to some of the biggest differences between the Australian Labor Party and the Liberal Party, is that when you leave the market do what it wants to do, then sometimes bad things happen. If you have regulation and if you have an investment in certain industries, then you can find that balance. And ultimately, one of the things that we're going to have to go through is this idea. And I think maybe you sort of read about Christina Keneally saying that we don't want any new migrants. Well, that's certainly not the policy of the Labor Party. It's not the policy of Albanese. It's not my policy. It's not Richard Miles's policy. And I think it was probably a bad media day more than anything. But certainly there is a legitimate discussion that's going to need to happen on the back of the coronavirus between how do we support people in Australia and how do we support jobs in Australia, while also making sure that our market, our businesses have access to the international community, and that also we are cooperating with the international community. And it's very difficult to do both if you're shutting off the borders, for one. So it's a difficult problem. It's one that we need to put a lot of thought into. It's one that we're having a lot of discussions internally in the party at the moment. But ultimately, it's really difficult to have nuance in politics at the moment. But geez, this world needs a bit of nuance and a bit of thought and a bit of depth in thinking and approach and policy, because at the moment, the people who are leading the populist media cycle governments at the moment are literally killing people.
Yeah.
Good question.
Quickly, we have like 5 more minutes. So there's been 2 people with their hands up. So yeah.
Right. Sorry.
No,
Tanya, you're in charge. You just cut me off whenever you need. All right. I'll stop.
No
I'll stop when you're the boss. You're the Fawzitzer tonight.
Moisha, did you had a question?
Yeah, it's good segue of what you just said, Josh, because there's 2 things that when we got to the mid-80s, we had something here that I think a lot of us never thought that we would ever accomplish, and that was Bob Hawke and the way that he ran the country, and things became possible that were never before possible. And it leads into something else. When we were going through SCIF, I think we all prided ourselves on, I don't want to say, I don't like this word because it sounds a bit elitist, but our intellectualism, even compared to a lot of our school friends who had sort of 1 or 2 track minds, and we thought about everything and spoke about everything. What we have now in the world, certainly in the Western world, is the opposite of that. There's no conciliation and trying to get things happening for everyone like we had with Hawke. And there's absolute blatant anti-intellectualism and anti-science led, by the worst people. I've found myself saying things that I never thought I would ever say about people, because I, value life and I love people, but there are things that, that are making me really concerned for my grandchildren's future. I wanted you to speak a bit about that. Yeah, as a politician, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the uber polarization of politics over the last 10 years or so, and the anti-intellectualism? And it's interesting because I for about a brief shining moment there, I actually even liked our Prime Minister because he was actually talking about science and providing some bipartisan leadership. It was only a brief shining moment, unfortunately, but we don't have that kind of Bob Hawke-ian thing anymore. How do you deal with that as a politician?
It's a really good question, Moish. Clearly the biggest influence in this has been Trump. Clearly the biggest influence in rise of populist leaders across the world has been the Trump model. And, this election in November in America is one that we all are quietly and loudly hoping for a good result, because it is not in Australia's interest to have a dysfunctional and an incoherent American president. It is not in Australia's interest to have an American president who creates a post-fact world where truth doesn't matter and science doesn't matter and facts don't matter. During a global health pandemic, to have the president of the United States giving advice around a specific type of drug that isn't being administered by their national health authority is, it is dangerous, bordering on negligence, bordering on just being a complete asshole. And so how do you combat that? Well, it is a really powerful force in politics, and it's a really powerful office that someone like that holds, and it also shows the importance of fighting these political battles. I think if there's ever been this sort of apathy in Australia around politics, well then surely this sort of virus can shake people into activism and shake people into this idea and this concept that, you can't ignore politics, you can't ignore the world around you, and you can't ignore the conversations that help shape this world. And it doesn't matter how big or small your contribution to the national debate is, you should be contributing and you should be participating in what helps shape this world, because if you don't, then these sorts of characters do. And we cede spaces to these people all the time. We cede intellectual spaces on nationalism and on what it means to be Australian, what it means to be American, to these conservatives who are creating these divisive politics. But the world has had big political pendulums in the past where it has swung from one side to the other, and it's important not to lose faith, and it's important also not to lose your sense of who we are. So, we are thoughtful, and we maintain that, and we try and offer thoughtful politics, because that is who we are, and that is what we do. But it is also important to not forget who we're fighting against and why we do it, because, you know, whether it be Australia or whether it be the United States or the Western world, it is, you know, politics is still, in my mind, something worth fighting for and worth being a part of.
Hey Josh,
and doing
I
it
know
to the
we're
best of your
running out
ability.
of time.
Right.
But me and Ryan have a joint question. So
Go for it.
I'm on Kevin Rudd's Facebook. Kev07's Facebook, right? And he posts a lot about Murdoch Media. And I saw one post about the error with JobKeeper being, what, $60 billion that was forcucked, right? And then it was comparing the front cover of a newspaper with the libs to money heist Kev steals, I don't know, 700 million from the banks. And then Ryan can ask the question.
So, like, the question is, before you were discussing, like, your party room politics and how you will approach politics in the future, but the prevailing question I have on my mind is how Labor will manage to get elected in a media landscape where the Australian public is being led to believe that the Liberal Party are being really competent during this time period, and that I believe, from what I'm seeing, Labor's really struggling to find a voice that overpowers this, like,
toxic Murdoch Media.
Yeah.
Very corrupt.
There's a little bit in that question. The first thing I would say is that just because it's a really good question. The first thing I would say is that just because a prime minister or a premier is popular during a crisis doesn't translate into an election victory. In fact, it often doesn't. Winston Churchill won World War II, but then was voted out shortly after. Closer to home, Anna Bligh was considered a hero after the Queensland bushfires, and then suffered one of the worst election losses only a few months later to Campbell Newman. Even in Victoria, John Brumby was the premier who helped the state get through the Black Saturday bushfires and was an outstanding leader during a crisis, but that didn't translate to an election victory for the Labor Party. So while I would say that the government is probably experiencing a bit of rallying around the flag right now, I don't think this election is going to be about the coronavirus. I think this next election is going to be about how we extract ourselves out of this economic hole of unemployment and inequality and a lack of opportunity for people. And ultimately, are people going to turn to a coalition government who perhaps gets rid of free childcare, perhaps lowers the rate of New Start, perhaps takes away the eviction moratorium, and perhaps takes away a lot of those social safety nets that sounded very similar to what a Labor Party would do or a Labor government would do, and goes back to their old ways of austerity, wage freezes, IR reform, insecure work and casualisation of the workforce. So I think that ultimately, don't lose faith at the moment, because there's still a crisis going on and we're not out of the woods yet. And hopefully the worst is over, but I still fear that we have a long way to go. But ultimately, the political battle for this country and the political battle for the next chapter and for the next election hasn't begun yet. It's going to be about the economy.
I hate to be this person to keep things
No.
running on. Wouldn't you say part of the greater problem is the media and the fact
Murdoch.
that they are pushing their own agenda?
In 2014 in Victoria, both the Herald Sun and the Age endorsed Dennis Napthine, and Daniel Andrews got elected. In 2018, the Age sat on the fence and then eventually sort of half said that Daniel should cautiously be re-elected, and the Herald Sun, of course, and the Australian said, over my dead body, and Daniel won 55 seats out of 88. It's difficult because it's unlikely that Murdoch is going to endorse a Labor Party, but at the same time, they threw everything at us at the last election. I think that a bigger influence is probably Clive Palmer's $83 million. So look, it's a factor, but it's not the only factor. And, you know, I actually say today that 100 News Corp jobs that were lost today is not a good thing for the country. It's not a good thing that we have less journalists out there. Many News Corp journalists are actually really good people. They, you know, the editorial lines of their papers is, you know, there for us to disagree with. But the fact that we have less media in this country or less journalists in this country doesn't make our democracy better. But perhaps, Mia, this is a longer conversation about media and media fairness and democracy that we should go through. But ultimately, having a free press is important, and they have a right to disagree with government. And you know, if we ever get to government, then they'll be able to say whatever they want about us, as long as we get to government.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for this evening. But thank you very much, Josh, for your words of wisdom, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you all, and you know, it's an extraordinary time that we're all living through. But I hope you all stay safe, and I hope you all stay well, and I look forward to seeing you in person soon. And if there's anything anyone ever needs or wants to come and have a coffee, my office is always open. So take care. Thank you.
Josh.